And so technically we're late. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a hot night on Monday night. I'm Danielle Bendon. This is my husband, Ernie Bozhart. We see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. It's good to see you again, and some new ones. We are here to give you sort of a summary of what we've been doing for nearly the past 2 decades in your community. So we're going to just spend the next maybe 25, 30 minutes summarizing our work to date and then really focusing on our excavations that are going on right now. We were out of the field about 4 hours ago. I look a lot cleaner than I did 4 hours ago. But so most of you are aware that for the last nearly 2 decades, we've been working in the community doing excavation. We may have even excavated in your yard or your neighbor's yard. We've been excavating on public property, and we have learned a great deal with the help of students from the University of Wisconsin system, from locals, some very young, and some, retired folks. So we've had 7-year-olds dig with us up to 77 and everybody in between. And it's been quite the privilege for us to be able to work in such a wonderful community. We have not only done excavation, but we've also interpreted what we've been finding. And so we have set up what is called the Trempealeau Interpretive Path, or TRIP. There are 3 venues in town, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there at your local library, there's a small exhibit case that displays some of the artifacts from our excavations. Off of Main Street, there is a kiosk and hiking trail up the Little Bluff Mounds. You might all be familiar with that. Hopefully you hike that regularly. And then there is Perot State Park's Nature Center. We put about 1,000 to 1,500 square foot exhibit in that space as well. And that has been closed, but hopefully in the near future that'll be opened again to the public. What we have been studying is really a story that starts about 1,000 years ago. So in the southern part of Wisconsin 1,000 years ago, including in and around Trempealeau, there are native people living here that archaeologists call the late woodland effigy mound builders. Effigy mound builders are building these animal-shaped mounds. There are some in Perot State Park. I'm sure you've all seen or know about them. There used to be thousands of effigy mounds in the southern part of the state. Unfortunately, many of them have been obliterated with the formation of communities. Agricultural practices have wiped them out. But generally speaking, in and around this region, there's no effigy mounds right in the modern village of Trempealeau, but within a few miles, there were several large effigy mound, effigy mounds themselves, but just groups of people living here, predominantly in the summer months where people would congregate because the river is full of food at that time. And then those groups of people would break up into smaller family groups and try to make it through the winter back in the hills using rock shelters. This is a seasonal round that people are moving across the landscape at different times of the year. That's what people are doing here. Native people are doing here about 1,000 years ago. At the same time, about 530 miles south of here, there is a big city forming called Cahokia. And at this time, Cahokia has nearly 30,000 people living in the community. So it's a big city. It's a big place 1,000 years ago. This is near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. Some of you I know have been there. If you haven't, it's a really spectacular place to visit. It's a World Heritage Site. But this is an artist's rendition of what Cahokia would have looked like. It really was a bustling place. There were artists and engineers and mathematicians and people who lived in a stratified society. So there were elites, there were commoners, there were farmers, and there are some pretty unique things about what archaeologists, the people who lived here, they're called Mississippian people. There's some pretty unique things about the Mississippian culture, and I'll just kind of point out a few because it's important for us to understand this because people leave Cahokia and come to Trempealeau. That's what we've been studying. They build what are called platform mounds. So instead of the animal-shaped effigy mounds, Mississippian people are building these flat-top pyramidal mounds. On top of those mounds, they would place houses or other kinds of structures for religious purposes. And this is an example of what their houses look like. So if you've ever been to like Belize or Mexico, you see these sort of like Mayan-looking wooden structures with thatched roofs. That's what Mississippian houses look like. We know that they were intensive corn farmers. They had huge fields. We see that in the stone hoes that they make. They also make shell hoes for gardening. We see it in statues that depict people, farming. It was a really important part of their lifestyle. They were intensive corn farmers. And they also made really distinctive artifacts. So in the top corner, there's a little arrowhead. It's called the tri-notched point. It's notched in 3 sides. Very, very different than the way the local late woodland people that are living in southern Wisconsin were making their arrowheads. Their pottery is very different than the local pottery in Wisconsin. They oftentimes will paint it red or have a black kind of slip on the outside of it. So there's a distinctive thing happening in Cahokia at this time. It's drawing people in for probably a lot of reasons why big cities are, there's lots going on, and there's something about it that draws a ton of people in. Right at that time, Cahokians, right as the city is forming, a group of them leave Cahokia and they travel 530 river miles north paddling canoes, and they come to Trempealeau. So for the last 20 odd years, we've been trying to understand why. Why did they come here? What were they doing here? When did they come? And why did they leave? These are sort of the basic sets of questions that we were interested in. We also wanted to know, was the community plan in Trempealeau similar to what you see at Cahokia? Are they living, this sort of the same way that they were living at Cahokia? So this is what we've been studying for nearly 20 years. One of the most common questions we get asked is, how do you know where to dig? And it's a really good question. And before we start any project, we always begin with standing on the backs of the people who came before us. And we are standing on the backs of many people, including these 2 gentlemen, T.H. Lewis and George Squire. And so they made some of the earliest maps of the Mississippian mounds that are on top of Little Bluff that are still there today. So this is an 1884 map by T.H. Lewis. He mapped the platform mounds on top of Little Bluff. Some of you may have hiked the trail to see those. And then George Squire, who owned the property, took some of the first photographs. He also made a map of Little Bluff as well. These are just 2. There are many others who had kind of begun to kind of put the story together. So we always start with, what do we know first, and how can we add to that understanding of these people who were here 1,000 years ago? So we've learned a tremendous amount, and one of the things we've learned is that the way that the mounds were constructed, the Mississippian people who came here, they're constructing their mounds identical to the way they were constructed at Cahokia. So this is one example. You'll see sort of the different layers of color in that mound profile. This is on top of Little Bluff. And the common theme is that at Cahokia, the practice of mound building is where you alternate layers of soil with dark and light and dark and light. And it probably has some connection to sort of like a duality with, night and day. And it's just a very unique way of building mounds, and it's exactly what they did when they came here as well. We've also learned a lot about their houses. Their houses are rectangular. Remember, they're rectangular, thatched over. they're building their house. We found their houses. These are 3 houses at Terry Uhl's. This is one house here. This is the second one that was deconstructed, and then another one was built over the top. So the houses last about 10 years or so. We have found those distinctive tri-notch points that I was telling you about, and this distinctive kind of pottery. This stuff was made at Cahokia and brought with them up here. It's really spectacular. And we've learned a tremendous amount about the pottery that they're using. Again, here's just a few examples of some of this really unique red painted, black polished, and decorated pottery that is Mississippian, made at Cahokia, brought with them to Trempealeau. The overwhelming majority of the ceramics and also the stone tools that we're finding are made at Cahokia, brought up. So almost 95% of what we have recovered has been made at Cahokia and imported. They've brought it with them. These are some examples of some of those distinctive stone tools. On the top, that's a pretty large size core. So with that chunk of flint or stone, you would chip away and you could make some finished tools like the ones you see on the bottom. These are a series of really special Mississippian points that have been found in Trempealeau. The last one is a little micro drill. So Mississippians make shell beads, and they use these little micro drills to do so. That would have been hafted onto a wooden handle that, of course, we don't have. We found lots of micro drills in Trempealeau. We have not found a single shell bead, which is really interesting. Where are the shell beads? This is just a map that kind of gives you an idea of where the stone is coming from. So you see Trempealeau on the map, you see Cahokia, and then you see the locations of where all the flint or the stone is coming from. It's really impressive when you think about the fact that they're going even further south from Cahokia to get this stone, and they're carrying it with them. It's really quite amazing. Some of the pottery that we have comes as far south as Louisiana and Mississippi. It's traveled quite a long way to get here. So just sort of in summary, right, in the 20 years that we've been doing this, we now know that there are sort of 2 complexes of people living. They're here at the same time. Mississippian people are living in a complex, in a sort of a little neighborhood, if you will, over by Little Bluff. And then another little neighborhood we call the Uhl complex over sort of off of 3rd Street. They're all centered on these platform mounds, these rectangular mounds. You can see denoted in the black and yellow rectangles. There are houses. We found several houses. 95% of their material that we're recovering is coming with them. And we've learned a great deal about why we think they came. There's still things we're not sure about. And what Ernie's going to do at this point is sort of take over and talk about our more recent excavations. One thing I want to point out before I hand it over to him is this map is showing you overlaid the modern village of Trempealeau. If you notice where we've excavated, we've been mostly on this high terrace. We've been mostly up top. We haven't really ventured down towards the river. And so that's going to set up exactly what he's going to tell you about here.
I think we have to do some transitional stuff here. So one of these advances, huh?
Just put that.
I can't do that. I can't see it.
Okay, I got it. Come here, let me get your lapel
right?
on.
All right, which one advances?
This one.
Okay. All right, thanks, Danielle. So yeah, she mentioned that we've been working for a long time, and all of our work has been up on top of this high terrace that we're on right now. We're 60 feet above the Mississippi River on the sand and gravel outwash terrace, and there's platform mounds at the Uhl complex. At Little Bluff, there's actually a higher, the Little Bluff complex is actually on a higher bench up through there, and then Little Bluff itself is up another 100 feet above that. So everything's up high, and we never really had any. We've never worked below these people came up the river, but we never worked down by the river until recently. So in 2019, the last time we were here, before last year, we did some shovel testing. We didn't do any excavation, but we went into some people's yards that we hadn't been in before, and we just dug holes about 1 foot in diameter, 2 feet in diameter, and every 10 feet or so, and we screened the dirt to see if there was sites there. That's how we find sites in grassy areas. We can't walk plowed fields in people's yards. So we shovel test, and we shovel tested, this is Vern Klingbeil's yard here. There's Pete Knepper's house in the backyard. We found all sorts of Mississippian artifacts in Vern Klingbeil's yard, up on top here again. And then we went across the street to Bob Stelflug's yard, and his upper yard was full of all sorts of fill, and we didn't find anything there, but he had this vacant lot that went from the top down towards the river. And that's what this is. This is looking from the top down towards the duck pond. And we shovel tested that vacant lot. And we started at the top, and we didn't find anything. And then we got all the way down to the bottom, in the last, right about where the screen is right through there, the last 2 or 3 holes, we started to find artifacts, including red painted pottery, Mississippian pottery. It was one of the first indications that the Mississippian occupation of Trempealeau also extends down to the river. And then this spring, the village did the duck pond project. So you're all probably familiar with this, but they brought in a big backhoe and they dug way down into the bottom to open it up to reclaim that pond, to get it nice again. They dug all sorts of dirt up and scooped it up, and they trucked a whole bunch of it away, and then they landscaped it and filled it in, and it was nice and green about a week ago until we came to town. But as that was being done, several people would walk along. And Pat Christensen came in, and he found this arrowhead, and he and Todd Lakey sent us pictures of these things, and it blew our mind, because that is a giant Mississippian side-notched point, and it's made out of high ridge variety Burlington chert, which comes from a specific place in just south of St. Louis, where Mississippians get their chert down at Cahokia. And it was like, this is a giant Mississippian point, a special chert, and what's it doing down by the duck pond? And he's like, he's walking along and he picks it up. And so we came to town like 2 days later, and he pointed out exactly where he got it. But the other thing that happened is several years before that, probably 10, 15 years ago now, Kim Gantz, the village electrician, had found an axe right in front of the Trempealeau Hotel. And that axe is a Mississippian axe. It's made out of a material, diabase it's called, that comes from the St. Francis Mountains, also in the Ozarks area, which is where the Burlington chert comes from. So at Cahokia, lots and lots of resources are coming from the Ozarks. And these both, the axe and that flint, are coming from the Ozarks as well. So they came up with the Mississippians. And the Trempealeau Hotel, of course, is down by the river. So now we got some couple things down by the river, and so we came by and we said, this is great, there's some stuff down here. We shovel tested, we got a little bit of stuff down, so it's telling us, go down the hill and start working. We didn't really want to, though, because it's so dang hot here. But we came anyway, and Todd and Pat and Roxroy, they agreed to allow us to come in and work this week. We also, our son Julian, this is Julian, and he's here. Hey, Julian. And Julian walked along the bank 3-4 days ago, and he found this red piece of pottery that had, we call them punctates, dots inside of it. That's a really special piece of pottery. It's part of what they call a seed jar. And this is a seed jar found down at Cahokia, and they're just very distinctive. They're red painted, and they have 2 rows of dots going around the rim. And so he got one of these really special jars down on the duck pond shore. So it's another indication. So we got permission to excavate, and I'll show you some excavations. But before we did, it's like, well, let's learn about the duck pond. So there's some maps from the 1840s, the Government Land Office survey maps. There's no duck pond showing on the Government Land Office survey maps. Doesn't exist. There's probably a slough down there, but it wasn't important enough for them to map. They mapped First Lake and Second Lake and Third Lake down in the bottoms, but not where the duck pond is. 1888, the railroad comes in along the river. 1894, the Corps of Engineers makes really detailed maps of the Mississippi River. And here's the duck pond for the first time. Here's the railroad grade coming in. Here's the main channel of the Mississippi River bouncing off downtown Trempealeau, and then it bends away over towards Winona. This is where the lock and dam is now in the marina, but there's the duck pond in 1894 after it's about 6 years old. So it exists at that point in time. And it also shows 2nd Street and a little strip of vegetation in between there in the duck pond. So the duck pond exists because the railroad came in and it blocked the drainage. And then in 1936, lock and dam is built. Oh, this is 1901 map showing the duck pond again with the railroad track. You can see the outlet of the duck pond is just a little thing that's blocked off by the railroad. 1936, the lock and dam is built, raises the water level, pool 6, up about 9-foot channel, but raised it 4 or 5 feet at least. So this is a 1938 air photo, right after the lock and dam is constructed. So the water's up now. This is the lock and dam and through here coming out, and here's the duck pond. But again, here's 2nd Street, and there's a strip of green with gray vegetation. A strip of land still there on this side of the duck pond. This is 2020 aerial photograph. So this is like 50 years later. There's the duck pond, there's the railroad tracks, and you can see along 2nd Street just a little thin sliver of green, right? But that land has always been there. So it gave us a little hope, and then Pat finds this point, Julian finds this potsherd, and it's like there's archaeology down there. Let's go and see if there's anything left. And the village allowed us to come in last Friday. Todd Leahy had got the bobcat out. And where we're digging here is there's 2 places in the bike. There's a curb between the bike lane and the street that they have these breaks through for drainage. Well, all the water, when you get heavy rains, you've had some heavy rains through this spring, all that water comes down slope and it funnels into those breaks. And then it started to cause erosion right away on the land that Todd had just planted seeds in. So they've decided to put in some drainage culverts in these 2 areas. And so it's going to be disturbed anyway, so we got permission to come in, and Todd's here peeling off the dredge spoil from 2 months ago that he put in there to take us down to the original surface. So we have to get below that to see if there's any archaeology down there, if there's any Mississippian stuff. So there's 2 trenches we did. This is the one that we're working most in. We're just below, this is this brown you see in this wall above the black. That's all the dredge spoil from this spring. Below that, there's a layer of grass. That's the grass from last year before the dredge project. And then we're into black soil below that. And that's essentially the original surface where we start to find Mississippian artifacts. And we found a fair amount of Mississippian artifacts. A little bit of woodland and some other things, but it's mostly Mississippian. And we've got some examples that we found just in the last couple of days in the display case over through here. But it's a volunteer crew we're working with, and we appreciate all their help. So that's us just starting the dig. We found this today. It's kind of corroded and dirty yet, but this is at the top of a pot, and you can see a little bit of red. Hopefully you can see it there, but that's a red painted pot, pretty eroded, but that's the top of a pot. We just got that today. We probably have 20 pots represented by rim sherds in the last 4 days. Today we also found the shell, and that shell, we came down at it, and there's a hole in it. There's a hole been punched into it, and this end, the upper end of it, if you can see carefully, it's serrated. It's got a series of notches. They notched that shell, punched a hole in it, and that's a classic Mississippian shell hoe. Never found one before. First time in Wisconsin, other than outside of Aztalan down in southeastern Wisconsin. So this is brand new. This is a replica of what that would have looked like. They find them down at Cahokia sometimes. Mostly they use stone hoes down there. They make these big, flat, chipped stone hoes made out of, it's called Mill Creek chert. We haven't found any Mill Creek chert hoes in Trempealeau, but we found lots of flakes of Mill Creek that have polish on them, so they resharpen their hoes, they knock off some flakes with polish on them. We find those scattered through town. We haven't found a hoe yet, so here we find a shell hoe. Pretty amazing thing to find. And that was like 8 hours ago. So the site we're working on is pretty. The soils are real kind of weird. If you get a chance to stop by, we'll be here tomorrow, probably Wednesday, and then we're going to wrap it up. But the soil is telling us a really interesting story. There's some pretty bizarre stuff going on down below, but there's Mississippian stuff on the river. Okay. What's interesting about Mississippian archaeology in the bottomlands is that Cahokia is in the American bottom. The American bottom is a big floodplain that's formed where the Missouri River comes in and and bounces off the Illinois side, and then it heads back to St. Louis, and it leaves this huge floodplain. This is 10, 15 miles long, but this is the American bottom. Here's St. Louis over here, and the yellow is the bluff line. That's the uplands. The bluffs down at Cahokia are like 200 feet high. They're nothing, but they're bluffs. But this is all floodplain, and you can see all the lakes through there. Those lakes are just like First Lake, Second Lake, Third Lake, Round Lake, and Long Lake. It's a bottomland of ridges and swales and lakes. Trempealeau bottoms are a miniature version of the American bottom. And we're at the north tip of that. The thing we're finding here in Trempealeau, we got the Little Bluff complex, the Owl complex up on top. Now we've got stuff on the bottoms. It may run all the way down through the Lakes District. This thing is huge. And if you think about these mounds that they're building, three mounds on Little Bluff, the mound at Ethel Ouellette's yard, Terry Ewell's mound, and there's another mound just north of that called the Church Mound. 5 mounds. They're moving all sorts of earth. It takes a lot of people. And so this thing is huge, and they have to feed those people. So at Cahokia, they're farming, and they're down in the bottomlands because that's great farmland. That's where you grow your corn. Now, the bottomlands back then weren't as forested as they are now. It was like a low, wet prairie, or low prairie. But that's where they lived. And that's where we got here. We got another version of that. This is Cahokia, another version of it, artist rendition, but there's 100-foot high Monk's Mound in the middle, and there's like 200 mounds at Cahokia, but it's in the bottomlands. You dig down 2-3 feet, you hit water table. And that's, so there's ponds everywhere down there. This is an 1851 painting of the Trempealeau Bluffs looking upstream from essentially where the lock and dam is now. And it's got Henry Lewis made this painting, but it's a little artistic rendition, but or license. But the bluffs, if you notice, are prairie, no trees on them. Trees are down on the islands. There's always wooded down there. But this is essentially the forest floodplain that would go to the duck pond. And the Milwaukee Public Museum in 1939, I think it was, they were donated this artifact, which is a chunky stone. I'll tell you about that in just a second. But that chunky stone came from the bank of the Mississippi River in front of Second Lake. That's down on the bottom. It's a half mile further beyond where we're at today. So chunky stones are really special artifacts. They're Mississippian, and what they are is it's a gaming piece. There's a game of chunky. And you take these, there's like a hockey puck size, and they roll these things on the ground, and they throw spears or sticks at them, and the game is whoever comes closest wins. The game continues up until early historic times. There's from records of it that talk about how important it is. People would gamble their lives away. They'd gamble their families away, their wives away, their kids away. It was a really powerful game. And chunky stones, this is the first one, the only one we know about in Trempealeau. Down at Stoddard, there's another little thing going on. There's 3 of them down from there. But that's down by Second Lake, that chunky stone is found. So there's stuff down here. I think this is where I turn it back to you. Okay. You got to do this one more time. Got it?
Yeah, I can just stand next to you too, I think it'll pick it up. Okay. Oh, and I got it. Hold on a second here. Get it out of your pocket.
No. There you go.
Yeah. So I think, it's a really compelling story for us. It's really exciting. It's wonderful to be back. What we're doing this year really adds to our understanding of the whole community plan. This is just much larger than we had anticipated. So we continue to kind of fill in pieces of the puzzle, and this year is just no different. It adds a new part of our understanding. We want to thank all of our wonderful volunteers who worked with us this year, who came together rather quickly. When we had heard this was happening, we all assembled rather quickly, and it's been quite a fun time with everybody that's pictured here, and also some who aren't, but you know who you are. And then the other thing I just want to plug is, if you haven't had a chance to go up the Little Bluff Mounds Trail, again, this red roofed kiosk is right up Main Street, right next to the Little Bluff Inn. Please do check it out. You can find more information at the website, tremptrip.com. Don't forget about the other 2 locations, the library and then Perot State Park. Nature Center also has some more information about this project and our work. And then we also would be happy to take your questions now. If you're interested and want to learn more, we have a few books for sale over here. We also have some of the artifacts from the excavation, so afterwards, please feel free to wander over and take a look. But at this time, we would thank you all for coming, and would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I have a question.
Okay, yes.
Did these people have like fiber? Did they make cloth or anything like that?
That's a really good question. We live in Wisconsin. So unfortunately, a lot of the perishable materials, which I imagine would be really fascinating to see, they don't preserve. And so very, very rarely do we find elements of clothing beyond just what's depicted in statues, like carved statues, or sometimes there's rock carvings and paintings that depict people and their, kind of what they're wearing. That's the little glimpse we get about clothing, but absolutely, they're clearly, making clothing and using textiles. There was one example at Ethel Ouellette's property we excavated. There was a copper celt that was found, and there was a very little bit of textile left on that copper celt, presumably because that copper preserved the material, that it looked like it was in some kind of woven bag. So a very little bit. Beyond that, it's just something we don't get a lot of because of the conditions through the 4 seasons.
You do get, there's another copper axe that was excavated at the Nichols Mound in 1920 for the Milwaukee Public Museum. And that copper axe, when they lifted over, had a nice patch of textile preserved on it. Copper sulfates tend to preserve that sort of stuff. But the other thing is that the not Mississippian, but the woodland culture, who was here when the Mississippians came up, and then going back to the time of the Hopewell culture 1,000 years before that, and even before that, the first time people made pottery in this area, they used cordage to form the pot. So when the pots are fired, they preserve the cord impressions. And you can actually take like a plasticine clay or latex and push it in there and pull it out, and you can see the positive version of those textiles. And people study those S twist, Z twist, and all sorts of ways they do it. It's not a cloth per se, but it's cordage. They're making it at least 2,500 years ago.
What are they using for fiber? Do you know?
Well, there's nettle. It makes a good fiber. They studied this stuff from like on the copper axe from the Nichols Mound, and I'm pretty sure that's nettle if I recall. But nettle fiber rolls real good. It's real tough type stuff. So there's plant material that you can use for it. Sinew is, that's for bowstring. You roll that. You can do that as well. You twist it, make it tighter, stronger.
Yes.
What about in Trempealeau? Have you found very many burial sites and human bones?
Good question. Very little. This is one of the pieces of the puzzle that we're missing. If people are up here, we think that Mississippian people are up here for about 30 to 40 years, and that's it. A very short, tight occupation. And presumably people died during that time. So, what happened to their remains? Were they buried here? Were they cremated? Were they taken back to Cahokia? There's lots of scenarios we could kind of play out. We just haven't come across Mississippian burials per se yet. Another piece of the puzzle that we don't know much about is what they ate. And it's not for lack of trying. We have taken tons of soil samples, hundreds and hundreds of soil samples, and have done a process where we look microscopically for, little bits of chard. We should be finding corn because they're corn farmers. We have found very, very little in terms of understanding the food stuffs that they're eating. That kind of data we often find at other sites. We found it across Trempealeau, so it's not that there's something going on in Trempealeau like with the acidity of the soil. It's nothing like that, because we find food remains at other sites in Trempealeau that date to a different period of time. But we just don't, that is one hole that we haven't been able to kind of plug in terms of our understanding. It could be that there's a midden somewhere, a big garbage dump location where things are tossed in a sort of a community-wide scenario as opposed to just an individual household throwing garbage out. So those are two sort of interesting pieces that we haven't kind of put together yet. Julian, you have a question.
Do they drink nettle tea?
Oh, did they drink nettled tea? That's a good question.
That's a great question.
You must have parents who are archaeologists.
Did they?
So we don't know, but there was a thing called a black drink that we know that the Mississippians were drinking down south, and it's not nettle, but it's a concoction that comes from a plant growing in the southeast, and it gives you a little buzz. So so they would drink that in religious sort of ceremonies in very special kinds of mugs that they made, and we actually, some of those French fork and sized pots that we found up that came from the lower Mississippi River Valley may have been used for the black drink. They probably did do nettle tea, but we just don't have any preservation of that.
Yes.
There were digs in the mid-'60s by the lakes.
Right. Yes.
Can you tell me a little about that?
Yeah, and I know some. And then there's also a gentleman rode by on his bike today and stopped and said when he was a kid, he used to ride his bike down to watch Joan Freeman from the Wisconsin Historical Society dig in the Hopewell Mounds down there. So those are 2,000-year-old mounds, and in those mounds were fairly elaborate burials. So they were excavating burials at that time, and learned quite a bit about the woodland period of time. So that's about 2,000 years ago. Those collections I know are at the State Historical Society, and they're curated in Madison. Do you want to add anything to Joan's?
So unfortunately, Joan has never wrote it up.
Yeah.
But she excavated in 1966, I believe, and Ken Wagner, your former postmaster, he actually made films. There's homemade movies of those excavations. Quite fascinating. Hopewell's an amazing thing. It's not Mississippian, but they're bringing in stone knives this big made out of flint that comes from the Rocky Mountains. And they're bringing it to Trempealeau and burying it in these Hopewell Mounds. Obsidian and one of the I think that's a Schwerk group, as they call it. It's a blue-gray flint Morrison formation, but it's remarkable. It's this giant thing, and copper axes and things like that. In one of those mounds, she found a red painted pot that was interpreted as a type called Brandenburg Plain, named after a site in Illinois, that is supposedly Hopewell. But it's a red painted pot, and that pot looks identical to the kinds of pots we're finding on the Mississippian sites up here. At the Yolette site, we found a copper axe in a Mississippian mound. Nowhere else in the Mississippian world do you find copper axes. So one very remote possibility is that the Mississippians got here, and the Hopewell Mounds, they recognized those as ancestral and such, but they went into one, and they put in a pot and took out a copper axe, and then put that in their mound. There's a place south of Cahokia called the Jackson Bottoms. It's the next big bottomland down there. Big Hopewell Mound. It was excavated a long time ago. In that Hopewell Mound, they found a Mississippian stone statue and a Mississippian burial that was put into a Hopewell Mound. So the Mississippians reutilize older cultural material. It's not uncommon to find, we found it here, in Mississippian garbage places, 5,000-year-old spear points that could only have gotten there by Mississippians finding that, picking it up, and just for whatever reason, putting it in their garbage. So they recognized the power of the past as well.
Yes.
That mound excavation down by the lake, the Hopewell,
Right.
did have a fire pit in it next to the skeletons with plant materials,
Yeah.
food material.
Not uncommon at all to have fire associated with a mound.
Really?
Yeah, and in part because mounds they're burial places, and if you go to a funeral, there's usually food. It's a gathering of people to remember someone, but you feast. That's part of the social activity that you exchange and reinforce family ties and social ties, and you tell stories, and they were doing that 2,000 years ago. Right? They have a feast, have a fire, build the mound on top of that. They did it in Mississippian times. They did it in Effigy Mound times. So it's not uncommon to do that.
Any other questions? We'll stick around too, and there's refreshments and food. There's food. Yes. Did you have one more question before? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you think there's more people here than you originally thought?
A resounding yes. Yes, it's way more people than we thought. Even more people than we thought even in 2017. Things really changed for us when we excavated at the Ouellette's property, because we realized that was another mound. And the amount of millions of cubic feet of dirt that they're moving to build these mounds, that takes tremendous labor. It's labor intensive, so you need people to do that. It really opened our eyes to, what it would take to actually do all the sculpting that they did here, and then to see now that this continued down to the bottoms it's slightly blowing our minds in a good way. But yeah, it really continues to expand our understanding of how many people were really here. So it's been very exciting for us.
A lot of people here for not very long, and they left a big mark. Tom?
What's in the future?
What's in the future?
What's in the future? Well, Friends of Little Bluff has food back there. That's in my future. And then Pat Christensen also, the artifacts we hear, Pat's Point is in here too, so please come up and take a look. So the future of our work in Trempealeau, or just in Trempealeau in general?
No, you're working on.
So,
we could spend the rest of our careers working in Trempealeau on this, and it would be an understatement to say that we enjoy what we do, working in your community, working with the people that we get to work with. It really truly has been our pleasure. So there's no shortage of interest on our part or excitement on our part. It's mostly just trying to really be careful about selecting areas that might have preservation issues, right? So that might not be here next year. Duck Pond is a perfect example, right? They're going to put a drainage culvert in, so this worked out really well for us to kind of see what's there before it's going to get obliterated. So I think our hope is that we continue to work on preservation, work on educating the community about how special it is here, what deep history you have here. And I think it's really just a matter of us. I think every year we kind of sit down and think about what the 5-year plan might be, but it is quite costly to do the work, believe it or not. It's very, very time intensive, not only in the fieldwork part of things, but all the stuff we need to do now when we go home. So we need to wash everything, we need to count everything and weigh it and analyze it, and we need to pay for a repository to care for it long term. So all of that costs money. And that's probably the biggest thing is so far we've been able to raise money. This was a short-term turnaround, but usually we have big grants to kind of support our work. So it's kind of a balancing act for us, right? It's
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's stuff in town, in people's yards, and you know, that's all good. In terms of research, if I was to look at, you know, the next couple of years, if I had a research grant and could come back to Trempealeau, I'd be interested in looking in the bottoms to see if we could verify whether the Mississippian stuff is down there, if it's as intense as what we're seeing down by the duck pond. To do that, you have to think about how, you know, working in Trempealeau in June and July is pretty nice when you're in somebody's yard, especially if they're shade, but then you get roots, so, you know, you always, but the bottoms in June and July, I'm thinking, you know, so that's a fall project. You come there in like September, October, beautiful time to be down there, right? Water's usually lower, and you know, but that's a whole different scenario to work in the woods, in the bottomlands, than coming up in the summertime. So, you know, when you're out there fishing, if you see something eroding out, let us know.
yes.
So you're saying they were here for just a few decades. Where'd they go?
Good. How much time do you have? No, it's a really good question. They look like they have a great thing going here. There's no evidence of there being any kind of conflict. There's no palisade. You go over to like the site of Astalan, which is about 50 years later in time than Trempealeau. That thing is a fort. It is like all walled off. It's tucked back in the middle of nowhere. They are hiding. They are not hiding. This is the superhighway, the Mississippi River. They're just, you know, very openly living here. So it looks like they had a really good thing going. Why they left is still a mystery. You know, presumably they could have gone back to Cahokia. There are no other sites that we know of that are going to fit that gap of time between when Trempealeau ends and a place like Astalan begins, because there's a 50-year gap. So, you know, at this point, we're thinking they perhaps went back down to Cahokia. Don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, it's just the heart, we don't know.
Yes?
What were your first indicators to make Trempealeau of interest for your research?
Trempealeau Hotel, burgers.
They got good local beers on tap.
So we used to be at UW La Crosse, and so we were nearby. We were close by, and there was this tantalizing early evidence that George Squire, T.H. Lewis, indications of the platform mounds. We knew nothing about Mississippi. There's no other Mississippian in this area except for one site by Onalaska. But you know, Jim Thieler and I wrote a book called 12 Millennia, the Archeology of the Upper Mississippi River, and the Mississippian section's about a paragraph long because there was nothing to say. That's 2003. So that's about the time when Terry Uhl called us one day, and he said, you know, I'm going to put a buried cable from my house to my shop. And he ditch witched that in, and he found red painted pottery, and he called us up, and we came up and we
dug under his shed.
So he said, I'm going to build a shelter,
a deck
on the back of the house. So we dug a test unit there, just volunteered to do it. And sure enough, there's Mississippian pottery there, and then something happened about a few years, well, right around 2000, and that was down by Stoddard. The Mississippi Valley Archeology Center, and Danielle was a student on one of those projects, and a colleague of ours, Connie Arzigian, was running a field school down there, but they just happened upon, in a woods, a little Mississippian thing. It's related to what's going on in Trempealeau. They got red painted pottery, they got the flint from down south, but there's no mounds there. So it's a habitation area. It's smaller than this. It's probably shorter than this. But it was like all of a sudden there's this middle Mississippian stuff popping up at Stoddard and then here, and then a colleague of ours from Illinois, a Cahokian specialist, just wanted to come up and explore up here. And so we wrote an NSF grant and spent 3 years up here, doing that.
But I will say too that we wouldn't have been able to do that without the help of local people. One in particular, and that's John Ebersold. So, it really was a us having interest, but also really making sure that we could come into the community and it would, be accepted. And John was a tremendous, maker of that. I mean, he made that happen for us. So it was a lot of things at once.
We call John Jesus because anything we needed.
Well, thank you so much for coming, everybody. We really appreciate it. I hope you stick around for some refreshments, and we're here if you have any other questions to answer.
Thank you.